Right, so last time we looked at setting up the Gradle files as well as sorting out the manifest, as well as sorting out the UI for the USB serial connection. We're now going to next be looking at the fun bit, which is the Kotlin code. So what we want to do is open up our main activity. Okay, so if we want to open up our main activity, and we're going to be creating our functions to start with. So we have our OnCreate. We then need a function for starting the USB connection. So that'd be private fun connecting. Okay. Then need another one. We need a function for sending data. So private fun send data. We need a function for disconnecting. And what we're also going to need is a bit different, and that's something called a broadcast receiver. And what this is basically used for is for setting up the serial is for actually setting up the serial connection to the device using the USB serial interface. So what it will basically do is that it will check to see if if it has the permission to if the app has the permission to use the USB. It will then look for what devices are connected. It will then try to establish. It will try to create a serial device from what is connected. It will then set up the different connection protocols. So that's the flow control, the bit rate, the baud rate, and so on and so forth. And it will and what actually handles the sending of data. So to do that, it is a private val because it is a read-only variable that we create called broadcast receiver. And what it is it is an object of type broadcast receiver. Doesn't need to put anything passed into it. But then we need to set up its override functions, specifically the onReceive. So override of function on receive. And because we use the hints, it then fills that in the rest of the function for us with what it needs to be passed in. Now, I don't know why it actually calls the parameters P0, P1, P2, P3. It just makes it a bit more complicated when actually coding it, I find. So instead, I just rename them to what they actually represent. So, for instance, context obviously represents a context, and then intent will obviously represent intent. Now, if you notice, you've also got question marks next to each of these parameters. What that means is that they are actually a nullable value. So what you have to do is actually need to check to see if it isn't null, or implicitly say this is not going to be null when you actually go to use them. Otherwise, it will throw up a bunch of error messages saying that it can't do this. Which is one of the advantages of using Kotlin over Java, is that it makes you think on when you're actually going to be using variables and what they could be. It essentially reinforces much stronger coding. And it also makes it a bit neater because you're not having to constantly do if x equals null then do this, else do this, or using guard variables. Just makes it a lot neater. So inside the function, what we're going to do is check to see if the intent action is the permission that we need. So if intent question mark dot action exclamation mark exclamation mark, and what that means is that this is explicitly not going to be null, is equal to action USB permission, then we want to do something. Now, as you can see, that's actually read it out, and that's because we haven't defined this yet in the state. So we're actually now going to set up the state now to make sure we don't have to worry about that any more errors like that coming up. So to start the function, we're going to create a later init, so a variable that we will declare later. Later init variable m underscore USB manager, which is of type USB manager. So this will be our USB manager object, and that's what actually contains the data of our USB. So, next, we will create a variable called m underscore device, which will basically be which is the variable that contains the data of the device connected. So it's of type USB device, and it can be null. So we're actually going to define it at the start as null. So the reason why we're doing this is because when it will not actually have a value until we've actually assigned it, when we actually have the data to assign it. It's a case of, we know for a fact that when the app is initialized, there won't be any data to put into that variable. So we need to make sure we explicitly say it is going to be null on a init. We can't do a late init var, because then that assumes that once it has its data, it will always have its data and will never lose its data. Whereas if you unplug the USB, it won't have any data. It will then be emptied. So next we need to create a variable for the USB serial device called m underscore serial device. Or actually, let's shorten it to serial. That'll be USB serial device, and this is where our third-party library comes in, which is also going to be nullable. And then we need to create our device connection variable. So var m underscore connection is of type USB device connection, and again is nullable. So then the last variable then we need to create is a value, so a read only, called action USB permission, and that will equal permission. Okay. Right. So as you already know, these are all grayed out because they're not being used, and then this one has a underline because it doesn't match the regex, because basically that means that it doesn't like how it's spelled, but obviously that's not a problem. So going back to the broadcast receiver, so we've checked to see if the intents action is checking to see if the USB permission is been asked. We then do value granted, which is a boolean equal intent, dot extras. So it's going to get some data from the intent. So we're going to be getting a boolean called USB manager dot extra permission granted. So it's basically telling us that the permission has been granted. We're then going to check to see if granted is equal to true, which done shorthand is just saying if granted. We then want to set up our connections. So m underscore connection will equal m underscore USB manager dot open devices, open device, m underscore device. We're then going to set our serial to equal USB device, serial device, dot create USB serial device. This one here. Passing in m underscore device and m underscore connection. Just like that. Really need to stop using semicolons, it's Kotlin. So if m underscore serial is not equal to null, so we actually succeeded in creating a serial connection, then I want to check to see if the connection is open. So if m underscore serial dot open, then we want to set the baud rate save a bit of time. I'm just going to copy and paste that. Dot set the baud rate to 9600. M underscore serial dot set data bits to USB serial interface dot data bits 8. M underscore serial dot set stop bits. Set stop bits to USB serial dot data bits 1, and then set the parity dot set parity to USB serial interface dot parity none, and then finally m underscore serial dot set flow control to USB serial interface dot flow control off. Now in here you can also set the read, which allows you to actually receive data through the serial, but right now we're only focusing on doing the writing to the serial. So if you would actually like to know on how to read from the serial, please let us know in the comments, and we will have an episode for that. So that's now basically the bulk of the broadcast receiver written. So we could leave it at that. However, it would actually be good if we actually had some else's to these ifs. So the first one we're going to do is that if the serial is closed. So else. So if the serial is closed, we need to make sure that we know it's closed. So we're going to do log.I serial, so we know, so we can search for it. And we're going to say that the port is not open. Port not open. We're just going to do an Alt Enter so that we can use logging. If the serial is null, then log.I serial port is null. If granted is false, then we want to say log.I serial and permission not granted, because that's the only reason why it'd be false. Okay, then we've got a few more down here. So if the intent action is not USB action USB permission, I'm going to do an else if. So intent dot action is equal to USB manager dot action USB attached. So it's actually received the fact that someone's plugged in to the USB port. Then we're going to do start USB connecting. Then we're going to do another else if. Intent.action is equal to USB manager dot action USB device detached. Just noticed I have the wrong thing here. Device. So if someone's unplugged the device from the serial, then we want to call disconnect, so that it's not trying to still communicate with a device that is not there. So just do a Control-C on that and rename that. And then that is our broadcast receiver set up. So next we now just need to cover the send data, disconnect, start USB connecting, and the OnCreate. So the first one we're going to do is the easy one, which is disconnect. Very simple. What we're going to do is set m_serial dot close, and that's it. That's disconnect done. We're then going to set up the send data. So this function is called whenever we want to send data to down the USB serial. So it's going to be very simply m_serial dot write, and we're going to be because we want to make this function reusable, we're going to make it so you pass in some data input as a string, and inside the write is going to be input dot to byte array. So it will be sending data down the serial as a byte array. And just to make it a bit easier for any debugging, I'm going to do log.I serial, and we're going to be sending data plus input dot to byte array, just so we know what is actually being sent to the device. Okay, so now the last one one of the last major ones that we need to deal with is the start USB connecting. So this is what will be used when the user plugs in a USB device. So what we need to do is create a read-only variable called USB devices. And it's going to be a hash map of key string to type USB devices. It's also going to be an optional variable, so it could be null, of m underscore USB manager dot device list. So it's going to get every single device that's connected to the device, every single USB device connected to the phone or tablet. And I'm going to check to see if that hash map is empty. So if not USB devices dot is empty. So if there is data inside of USB devices, then we're going to create a variable vault called var keep equal true. And then we're going to iterate through each connected device. So USB devices dot for each. So this is how you do an iteration for a hash map in Kotlin. You call the hash map, and then you do dot for each, and then using a lambda function. So curly braces, arrow, so hyphen greater than, I believe that is, new line. But what we need to pass in, this is what's being passed in, so entry. So each iteration is going to be called entry. It's going to be m underscore device is going to be equal to entry dot value. Then we're going to get the vendor ID of the device. So val device vendor ID, which is of type int, equals m underscore device question mark dot vendor ID. Now what we're going to do is to find out what that vendor ID is. So what we're going to do is log.i serial again, and inside that it's going to be vendor ID. Vendor ID colon space plus device vendor ID. And the reason why we need to do this is because if you don't actually know what the device you're connected to, what the vendor ID of the device is. Why we're doing this partly is because depending on the type of Arduino you're using, they have different vendor IDs. So for instance, I'm using an Arduino Nano, so I know for a fact that the vendor ID is 1027. However, if you're using another device, then you'll need to know that device's vendor ID, and this is the way you would actually do it. So once we then know what our vendor ID is, we're going to do a check to see if the device's vendor ID is equal to the one we're looking for. In my case, because I'm using an Arduino Nano, it'll be 1027. So if that is the case, then I will be doing val intent, which is of type pending intent, equal pending intent dot get broadcast, passing in this as the context, request code as 0, intent bracket action USB permission, and not setting any flags. We're then going to get the permission from the USB manager. USB manager dot request permission of m_device with intent. And then we're going to set keep to equal false. Of course, I just noticed I had a typo at the top, so it's not key, keep. And then we're going to do log.I serial connection successful. However, if the vendor ID is not what you were expecting, it needs to set up an else to be, so m_connection is null, so you're not communicating with the device. You're clearing that device's data from the cache, so m_device equals null, and then log.I serial, in fact, and say to the log that you are unable to connect. Okay. Then one of the last things you then need to do is, after all that, you then need to see if not keep. So if keep is false, so if you've connected, then return, because you've now set up the connection. The reason why you would do it there is so that if we find the device we want to connect to, we don't then keep looping through and thereby overwriting what we've then found. Okay, so then the last thing we need to then do is put an else on this if. Log.I serial no USB device connected. Pretty self-explanatory on why you would hit that else, because there are no USB devices. So yeah, that's pretty much everything that we need to do for those functions. The last thing we need to then do is set up the OnCreate. So it's very simple. First, we need to initialize the USB manager to equal get system service context, passing in context dot USB_service, context with a capital C, because you don't want to pass in the activity context. We want to initialize that as a USB manager. Then need to set up a filter. So val filter to equal an intent filter. Not passing anything in. Then we need to add some actions to that filter. So action USB permission, filter.add add action USB manager dot action USB accessory attached, filter dot add action USB manager dot action USB device attached. And then finally, we need to just set the register receiver. So we then need to register our broadcast receiver. So register receiver broadcast receiver, and filter. And really, that's all that's actually needed for setting up for serial connecting. So now what we're going to do is just bring everything together, the UI and the Kotlin together, by setting up our on-click listeners. So with Kotlin, very simple. So on dot set on-click listener, because in Kotlin we can refer to UI elements directly. So on, and what we're going to be calling is send data, and I have programmed my Arduino to receive an O for turning it on. Off.set on click listener, curly braces, send data, and to turn it off, it receives an X. And the last two we need are the connect and disconnect. So no disconnect dot set on click listener. So when you click disconnect, it will call disconnect. And then the last one we need is connect dot set on click listener, and it will call start USB connecting. And that is the entirety of the Kotlin code written. So next what we're going to do is press play to build it. So all you do is just press that green button at the top. We'll bring up the deployment target, and then you'd want to install it onto a Android device that you have plugged into your development machine. I don't actually have one plugged in right now, so I will go and get one, plug it in and install it, and we will see it working on the device.